Hey everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. And, exhausted. I just turned in the second draft of my very first feature film and basically spent the last couple weeks burning the candle at both ends and the sides and from the inside out. So that's where I am. I'll try to bring a little energy to this. Look, this intro, it's like 2 minutes long. All right, you can hit the 15-second button a couple times if you already know about the guest. But if not, for those sticking around for the next minute and a half, I'm going to turn it on right now. Hey, everyone. A great guest today. This is Ram V. If you don't know who Ram V is, why don't I read you his bio right now? An author and comic book writer from Mumbai, India, Ram V's comics career began in 2012 with the award-nominated comic series Agori. Since then, he's written a ton of great comics, including Paradiso and Blue and Green for Image, The Many Deaths of Layla Starr for Boom, Graffity's Wall for Dark Horse, Swamp Thing, Justice League, and Catwoman for DC, and he is co-writing the next run of Venom with Al Ewing, another one of my favorites. I read The Many Deaths of Layla Starr a couple weeks before we recorded this. I loved it so much. It's one of the best things I've read this year, and I wrote Ram immediately, and I was like, I gotta talk. And this was super interesting. Ram walked a very similar path to myself into a creative career. So as usual, from a very narcissistic perspective, I was interested in Ram's journey, but also I think if you are not me, you will also find it to be a fascinating story. So stay tuned. By the way, if this is your first time listening to Beginnings, thank you for checking out the show. I've done this for about 11 years, and if you like what you hear and you want to check out some other episodes, I like to do a little recommended if you like here in the beginning. If you like Ram V, if you like comics, you might like my talks with other comic book creators such as Chip Zdarsky, Chris Claremont, Rob Guillory, Cy Spurrier, Michael Kupperman, Sina Grace, Jackson Public, many others. You can subscribe to the show if you want, wherever you get your podcast from. And of course, I am on Twitter and Instagram at Andy Beckerman. Twitter for dumb jokes, Instagram to see pictures of my wife and our pets. So that's basically how it breaks down. Got some really good episodes coming up, including experimental guitarist Daniel Wyke. We just had a fantastic talk. And Brent Jennings, this was very exciting. Brent Jennings, who plays Ernie on Lodge 49, one of the best shows in forever. So that's coming up. Exciting. But for now, let's talk to Ram. I'm very aware of my own mortality, and especially when it comes to like in video games, if it is a repetitive thing and it's just like, you just have to learn how to like throw, like I've been playing this game. I have a Switch and I've been playing this game, Phoenix. It's like basically like Zelda in Greek mythology.
Right. Okay.
And I'm in this one thing where it's just like so when I play video games, I go on the exercise bike so that I can try to kill two birds with one stone.
Sure.
And there's just this one thing where you have to learn how to throw this metal block the right way. And I go on the exercise bike 30 to 45 minutes at a time. And I've been doing the same thing like 3 or 4 times. And at some point I'm just like, my brain goes, you are mortal. You do have a limited time on this earth.
Yeah.
Maybe
there
move
are better
on.
things to be doing.
Yeah. Maybe this thing, which is not necessary, by the way. I don't have to. This is not part of the. I don't need this to win the game. It's like to get something small. And did you have like when you were playing World of Warcraft? Was there that kind of thing in the back of your head?
Not really. At the time, you see, I was studying to be a chemical engineer. And pretty much anything I could do to take my mind off the fact that I was studying to be a chemical engineer was welcome. I wasn't particularly enjoying it. It's not something I had wanted to do, but it was the thing that was done if you were like an Indian kid. Like my father was an engineer, my mother worked for a bank, and so it was very go find yourself a vocation. And so I was good at it. I was studying at Penn. So I had gotten admission to one of the top universities in the US, but my heart wasn't in it. And the moment my heart isn't in something, I'll just find ways of sabotaging myself, if you will.
Well, you don't know this, but that was exactly my story in grad school. I was going to Temple for philosophy, and I basically, very unconsciously, very subconsciously, I had something sub my consciousness sabotage myself because it's not what I wanted to be doing.
Right. Yeah. It's been that way with me as long as I can remember, with absolutely everything. Like nobody has to motivate me to read or write or draw or play guitar. I will do those things obsessively. And then the moment it comes to something I don't want to do, my brain will just be like, nope, not doing that. You can put a gun to my head. I will not do it.
Was there anything about chemical engineering that you liked, or was it just like you had to pick something that was a professional class type job?
My father was a very successful chemical engineer in India. So I think the presumption was I would go back and work with him. And I did for 3 years. And then at the end of that, I was just like, look, I can't be 60 and look back at this and go like, maybe I should have done the other thing. And so I have to take my risks, and I did. It didn't go over very well to begin with, but it appears I genuinely had, talent to do what I'm doing now. And once I started kind of looking at writing as a professional career, I've done fairly well. I only started writing in 2013, started writing comics in 2015. 2016 was when my first sort of internationally published book came out. And then since then, it's been a progression that I'd be proud of. Yeah.
Do you mind if I probe just a little bit that decision to break away from your parents' desires? Because that was a very difficult thing for me. And I'm curious about how, if it was, what the process was just exactly for you, mentally, emotionally.
It was one of great anger and confrontation. My dad and I, my dad raised me to be very much like him. He's a very independent thinker, very smart man, has done very well for himself in his field of choice. And he raised me to be like him until it got to the point where he was like, nah, you have to work with me. And I go like, no, this is not something I'm interested in. And I think that is certainly in India, born out of a concern for kids to have a successful life, successful career, earn money, because given the population and given the state of the economy, growing up in India, especially in terms of vocation studies, can be a very competitive thing, like an inherently competitive thing, where, if you take a couple of years to figure out what you want to do, which is a thing you can do in the States, you can do in the UK, you do that in India, that's it. You're behind by 2 years now. Everybody else has taken the jobs that would have come your way. Of course, that has changed since my early 20s to now. That has certainly changed. But that is the circumstance within which I went to my dad and said, look, we're not getting along. It's not going to happen. I'm not going to be able to work with you. Just let me do what I want to do. And I hadn't made up my mind if writing was going to be the thing I was going to do. Of course, I had written a few short stories, poems here and there, just things as a hobby by then, and those have been published. And so it was more a case of like, okay, now that I have mentally decided that I'm free to make this choice, what do I really want to do? then it took me maybe a year to kind of figure out that, yeah, this is what I wanted to do. And a very good friend of mine at the time, an architect in Delhi, who I had met at Penn, his name was Rajiv. He said to me, look, you spent like 7 years studying something you didn't want to do. Why don't you spend a couple of years studying something that you do want to do? And I found that to be sound advice. So I moved to the UK, studied creative writing, wrote my first graphic novel toward the end of the second year. And the rest from there was smooth sailing, I suppose.
I mean, even though you had done written a couple short stories and poems, you said they got published. Were there family members? Were there friends, people in your life who you had seen do this kind of thing? Or were you completely on your own? Because that when you say risk, like it's one thing, like, I mean, I don't know what it's like in India necessarily or at all, but outside of like political kinds of things.
Sure.
But if you don't come from money here, if you don't have like a family member that's in the industry, it's really difficult. Like I found it, both my wife and I have found it to be challenging to really break in,
Right.
Or to know how to even, even beyond that, the knowledge of how to do it is.
Yeah, I think that's what I was gonna come to know. I mean, I don't have family members who are in the industry or who have been in the industry, if you will. The closest I can think of is my grand uncle used to write stories that appeared in Tamil magazines every once in a while, and I didn't know him particularly well. So it wasn't like I had a an example or an idol to follow, if you will. But the thing that was certainly to my benefit was that I came from a fairly comfortable, fairly well-to-do family. Like I could afford to take those 2 years of education plus a year off to really figure out what I wanted to do. And I had savings by then to support myself, but I wouldn't have had those savings if my parents weren't as comfortable as they were. Like my parents paid for me to go to Penn and study and live in the US. And that's a quite a weighty thing to do. And if I had to pay for that myself, I would have no savings even now.
Right.
So of course, in that sense, I was quite lucky. And it was a conversation I had with my dad as well. He said, you're very lucky to be able to do this. And to an extent, I agreed. But I also said, yeah, but I can only play with the cards that I've been dealt in life. And so I suppose the way I looked at that was, yeah, I am very lucky to be able to do this. So I better make the most of it. So that was one thing. The other thing, which was kind of you already touched on, is while I didn't have an example of someone who was already in the industry, having worked as a chemical engineer for close to 7 years, and then part of that as someone with fairly high up in an entrepreneurial organization, I had an understanding of, okay, how do you break through industrial barriers? By that I don't mean giant walls of steel, but I mean,
Sure.
I mean every industry, every sort of vocation has its barriers to entry, to take a very terribly economic term. But if you look at writing or comics or graphic novels that way, and you really analyze, then I came up with a strategy that I knew would work for me. I knew I wasn't the kind of guy who was good at, going to conventions and meeting all the right people and sort of getting your name out there. I was terribly embarrassed at having to introduce myself to complete strangers,
Yep.
But the thing I found that I was good at was doing the work. And then once I had some work in my hand, at least, I don't know if you want to call it some measure of ego or some measure of understanding or taste, I could look at my work and I knew that it was, at least it belonged with the top, whatever, 5, 10, 15% of work that was out there. And so once I had that, it was incredibly easy. I remember an anecdote in particular where I was meeting with an editor who had been an ex-Vertigo editor at the time, and Vertigo Comics was something that I had sort of grown up idolizing, if you will. And so I went to this editor, fairly nervous, my first published graphic novel in hand, and she, rightly so, was very tired at the end of her day. And she said, "Look, I'm not looking at any more books. I'm too tired. People have shown me too many books today. Unfortunate, but I'm off now." And I could have been sort of heartbroken at that, but I inserted my card, business card, in the back of the book and put it on her table. I said, "Look, if you pick it up when you go home, great. If you then happen to read it, even better. If you then want to give me a call, my number's in the back of the book." And I left. And then 3 months later, she emailed me going, "Hey, we should look at working together," which was really nice. And I would much rather my work do all of that work for me rather than me having to go and network and reach out and all of that.
Yeah, but that confidence, see, I mean, I think there's this underlying kind of confidence to be able to do that. That's very like, I don't know if I would have that.
But that's confidence in the work. I've had that since the very beginning.
Yeah. It's yes. Yeah. I do you know what it is? It's more that like I have very recently have I been like comfortable being like, "Oh no, I'm a very good writer. And you should like this. Here's a script. You should like this because it is I've been on this earth long enough to know like what is garbage and what is good.
Yeah.
What is baseline good."
You know, the Dunning-Kruger effect is a very real thing. So I'm very aware that you could be so close to your work that you think it's genius and other people look at it and go like, "Oh my God, this is terrible." But I'm a fairly self-critical writer. And I find in my experience that most other creatives I meet who are good at what they do tend to be quite self-critical. And I know there's this sentiment of like, "Oh, don't be too hard on yourself." But I kind of prescribe to the other thought process, which is being hard on yourself is your way of figuring out when you are good enough to do something. Mm-hmm. So I suppose if you're hard on yourself to an extent where when you finish something and you realize that, okay, I'm actually kind of proud of this, and then you have the experience of going out into the world and putting that out there and seeing the kind of response it gets, your brain creates this correlation between, okay, I thought my work was decent enough to send out and other people really loved it. And so you kind of form this relationship in your brain to where you go, okay, my criticisms in these areas are valid and I should pay attention to them. If you kind of approach your work that way, it becomes, over time at least, becomes a very good gauge of, okay, is this ready to send out? Is the script good? Is the story any good? So I suppose building confidence that way is very useful to let you avoid having to build confidence in other things.
Yeah. Do you know what it is too? There's this kind of, I know that I can write I can write something good. Can have the ability to. Not everything I do is. Sure. But like there's this, I have this self-awareness that there is also a gap between what I think is good and what gets made. Right? Sure. Especially in the television and film industry.
Sure.
Where, you know, the economic costs of making this stuff are so much greater that it's more of a risk for people to like invest in something, right? And it is that gap, I think, that is sometimes daunting. And I don't know if you feel that too ever.
I mean, I think, sure. I mean, I've experienced that, you know, in comics, in other work that I've done. But I also think when you get hired to do something in a creative industry, you're being hired for something that you can uniquely do in a lot of cases. the reason your script gets made, the reason your comic gets made, the reason your novel gets published is because it is, at least to the editor's eye or to the commissioning person's eye, in some way unique and authentic to what you can do. Unless you're looking at a purely commercial hire for something. And so in that regard, once you've understood that, you realize that there are definitely going to be occasions where the work that you've done is not necessarily going to translate to someone picking that up because they completely understand it in its entirety and go, okay, this is great and this is going to work. There is always an element of, I am picking up this person's work because what they have done before has proven to be successful. And there is enough here for me to go, okay, there's some potential to this. And those two things are always in competition with each other. So anyone who's giving you your first gig is taking a massive risk, regardless of how amazing you are. They are on some level taking a massive risk. But then over time, you realize that you go, okay, look, this is all the stuff that I have done before. And so I really shouldn't have to justify to you that I'm capable of executing a book or a script. And then when it gets to that point, that's when all of those commercial considerations fall by the wayside, in that you've kind of demonstrated the success of your work, maybe not on the same scale, but on some scale. And I feel like certainly with me, that has been the case where when I first wanted to publish Black Mamba, I approached pretty much every American publisher I knew of, if you will. None of them knew me. And Chris Staros, who was the publisher at Top Shelf at the time, wrote back a very kind email to me. And he said, look, I read your work. It's very good work, but you're going to have a hard time finding anyone who will publish you because you're unknown. This is a black and white book, and you've set it in Mumbai, and we don't know that there's a market or a readership for stories set in Mumbai. And I said, fine. So what do you recommend I do? And he said, I recommend you self-publish it. And we did. And I approached self-publishing in much the same way I've approached everything else. So I understood the process. I looked at graphs, data, yada, yada, yada. And when we self-published that book, we raised somewhere close to £15,000. And I went out and I made a beautiful hardcover book that would sit on the shelf next to Marvel, DC, Image, IDW, Dark Horse, any of those guys, and it wouldn't look out of place. And then once that was done, it's funny, 3 years after that, I'd done work with Image by then. I was just starting to do work with DC, and another publisher approached me and they said, we want you to do something that is in the oeuvre of what you do, which is these kind of India-centric, Mumbai-based stories. And I thought to myself, this is really funny because it's this, if I'd pitched something that sounded exactly like that to you 3 years ago, you would have said, we have no idea if this is going to sell. And so I think part of that change in the way your work is perceived is also just a matter of continuing to do good work and upping the game each time from your end. So you almost get to a point where you're the one selling your script, not necessarily the concept, To keep going, sorry, I know I've been talking about this for a while, but I'm reminded of a Frank Gehry quote where someone was interviewing him and he said, look, early on in my career, people hired me to make buildings and I made them buildings. And those are now Frank Gehry buildings. And then he turns to the interviewer and goes, but now people hire me to make Frank Gehry buildings. And the difference in that statement is, I think, what I'm trying to point to.
Okay, so here's the thing that from us talking for the last 20 minutes or so that I've gotten, you have a very measured approach, a scientific approach, I assume comes from your background, right? Sure. As a chemical engineer, where you're like, okay, I'm going to study, I'm going to actually do research and see like how to do these kinds of things. I would call this somewhat like emotionally healthy. You seem to have a kind of good attitude towards this. And I'm very curious about, does this go back to your childhood? Does this, were you like this as a child? Were you this measured in your approach towards doing things?
This is gonna go back to World of Warcraft. This goes back to my gaming days, because I think when I started playing that game, I hadn't played MMOs or any kind of RPG games or whatever. But I kind of fell in with a crowd of people who were fairly hardcore gamers, game designers and such. And I looked at the way they would figure out how to beat the game. And it wasn't, hours and hours of playing a character. It was Excel sheets and charts and numbers and probability chances. And what's the hit rate of a spell and how much resistance does another character have, yada yada. But that kind of data-centric analytical approach to something that's supposed to be just fun was very new to me, and it opened up my brain in a lot of ways. And so I compartmentalize when I work on a thing, and my endeavor is entirely creative. I put my analytical brain aside and I write. A lot of my stories tend to be focused on fundamentally human emotions. All of the fantastical world building sci-fi stuff tends to come in service of that. But when I'm done with that and someone goes, okay, do you want to do a variant cover? Do you want to approach publisher A, or do you want to approach publisher B? When that happens, my brain just goes, okay, well, let's look at what they've published before. Let's look at sales. Let's look at retail. Let's look at, and so I found that kind of compartmentalization to be very useful. I don't do it as much anymore because over the years, I've found people to do that for me,
right?
Which is great. But yeah, I very much understand the implications of what it means to have a book published, have a book printed, have it go out.
Can I probe this a little bit? I found myself to be a very bifurcated person in the past, and I found it very difficult to jump from an analytic, because I studied philosophy. I was going to be a physicist originally, and then I got into philosophy, and in America, philosophy is very logic-based.
Mm-hmm.
So I found it difficult to jump between that mode and a creative mode and like a comedy mode. If I was like giving someone facts about something or going through some kind of like philosophical discourse, I found it difficult to jump into a playful mode from there. They were two very separate modes with a wide gulf in between. And as I've kind of existentially settled, I found that bifurcation has, I was going to say healed, as if there was some kind of rupture early on, but like let's just say that it's lessened. And I find it very easy to jump from mode to mode. And I'm wondering if that's the same kind of thing that you have, or what it's like for you in your brain.
I think my ability to do that probably comes from my admiration for the great Renaissance artists, scientists, innovators, tinkerers, if you will. They were none of them entirely analytical or entirely creative and artistic. You can take Da Vinci. The man was a scientist, an artist, a philosopher, a storyteller, all of these things, and I think we lose something in this modern era when we educate ourselves to be one or the other.
Yeah.
And I think it's just a matter of circumstance in life and the way I grew up. I grew up with a very analytical background, but having a natural inclination towards being very creative. So I suppose as a natural consequence of that, I kind of found a middle path. And I suppose when I was very young, it was very useful to have my father there, who is a scientist by profession, but he always kind of drilled into my head that even science, beyond the realm of what we understand with a very high degree of precision. As you go farther away towards the fringes, the precision kind of falls off, and our understanding is largely a creative exercise in rationalizing what we observe rather than truly understanding why these things happen. And so that becomes very useful when you are actually doing some kind of groundbreaking research. You need some measure of lateral thinking, some measure of creative thinking, even with very analytical scientific subjects. Part of the reason, I mean, you mentioned physics. I loved physics when I was a kid. When I was in college, I always did very well with physics, partly because it wasn't, to me, all about, writing down equations and acceleration and radius and mass and all of that. It was more visualizing, why planets orbit each other.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that kind of understanding of it actually borders far more on creativity and visualization and the ability to perceive largely technical mathematical concepts as almost pictorial ideas in your head.
Sure, like Richard Feynman.
Yeah. And so I've certainly started finding the beauty in science when I used to do that. And I think that's something that stuck with me for a very long time.
I mean, I think something you said that was interesting, in America, especially like an American, like, I went to a public school, and it's a crapshoot whether your education is going to be good or bad there. Yeah. And well, probably it's a crapshoot anywhere in America, but like there are very strict disciplinary lines, and you are taught these very strict disciplinary lines. And so I think that's like the basis of this kind of like difficulty of moving from one mode to the other, because when I was younger, I tended to think of these things as very distinct regions, as opposed to now where I'm like, oh no, because like, I mean, as I was going on and on in grad school, I eventually started doing like philosophy of complexity theory and applying that to how history works and how culture works. And it got like very weird. And I'm curious about, obviously, well, I mean, you tell me, what is the educational system that you grew up with? Like, what was it like in Mumbai? Obviously, I assume, there's some kind of like English flavor, but.
Yeah, I mean, I was educated in an English medium school. And I went to college, and the medium of instruction there was English as well.
Oh, I bet British maybe is more what I.
No, it wasn't particularly British. In fact, it was very bad English. Rather colloquialized. Like, I didn't go to a very good school. I didn't go to a very good college either. Again, one of those things I was just not interested in. And so I would do very well at things where I felt inspired, or I liked the teacher, or I was interested in it some way. So I would always do well with physics, do well with English. But I'd be terrible at math. I'd be terrible at chemistry. And so I didn't really go to a very good sort of educational institution as a kid. Really, the change for me was after I moved to the States, and I started studying at Penn. And I found that at Penn, the interest was less in producing an engineer and more in producing a very well-educated person. And I found that to be truly inspiring. I don't know if this is still the case, but when I was there, you could pretty much talk to any professor and go, hey, I'd like to come sit in your class. I'm still taking all of my credits that I need to. But, I realize chemical engineering has nothing to do with jazz appreciation, but I'd love to sit in anyway, if that's cool with you. And the professor said, yes, you could. So I did that. I did film studies, jazz appreciation, business studies, while I was supposed to also be studying engineering. And I found myself interested in all the extracurricular things rather than being interested in the engineering aspects of it. I also met friends who were very, very good at what they did. One of my friends had multiple PhDs and was doing his third PhD. He had PhDs in anthropology, architecture, and I think he was doing another PhD with history and architecture combined. Insanely intelligent guy, also from India, and so just being around people like that who you realize are very good at what they do, academically inclined certainly, but also just fundamentally creative and interesting people, and just being able to observe how they function, I think changed a lot of things for me.
Huh. So it really seems that the rupture of coming here to America to study at Penn was extremely formative, to the point where it seems like I mean, you tell me, what were you like before then, and how did it really transform you on like a, fundamental or existential level?
I think before I went there, I was playful. I was always playful, kind of scatterbrained. And I think part of that is because the creative side of me had never been engaged in anything with any measure of seriousness before. And so I had it had no purpose. And so it was running around all over the place, if you will. And that had a detrimental effect on the analytical side of things because I had no focus, because again, I had no interest. But as I said, by the time I moved to the US, I had started writing a little bit, so I knew I had an interest in that. I knew I had an interest in music. And so all of these things were starting to happen around the same time. And then once that kind of the environment changed and I found that I could engage myself creatively in all of these things that I was doing, all of a sudden there was purpose, there was focus. I was no longer playing the guitar just because I enjoyed it at 3 a.m. in the morning. I was playing with a band. I was playing on a stage, and I was no longer writing, just for myself. I was sending these things out and getting them published, while also being fairly good at my chemical engineering studies. And so I realized there that I'm capable of doing something regardless of my interest in it, purely from an analytical standpoint. But I'm also capable of doing something very well without a formal education in it, just because I'm creatively interested in it. And so I think post that, I was very clear on what I needed to do to be good at something that I actually wanted to be good at.
Yeah. I mean, did you completely shift as a person then? Because that's what it seems like, the way you're telling me.
Yeah, absolutely did. Yeah. I think one of the first reactions to this I remember is going back to visit my parents some 3.5, 4 years after I'd been in the States. And my mom remarked, like, you speak very differently. You think very differently. I haven't heard you speak or think like this before. Like, where did you learn that? And at the time I blamed Rajiv, because he's a very smart guy. But I think it was a matter of, in no small measure due to friends like him, but also just the environment that I was suddenly finding myself in.
Was that scary at all? Because I think about, like, when I started therapy, there was this kind of fear about, like, well, I'm going to I don't know about drastically. Like, I've been in therapy for about 8-9 years now, and I haven't, like, drastically shifted, but I'm definitely a different person than I was before I started that.
Sure.
And it was scary.
No, I mean, I don't, to me, it wasn't scary, partly because none of those things had any real consequences for me at the time, outside of growth and self-awareness and understanding. I imagine that's not the case with therapy. Going through therapy has real consequences for you in an everyday life kind of thing. I was just absorbing the world around me. It was the first time I had lived in a place by myself. First time I was making friends by myself. First time I was meeting people and had no history. There was no way they could know where I was coming from because. So there was almost a sense of making a fresh start, and I could be another person if I wanted to, and then add to that this environment at Penn and the friends that I found myself with. So yeah, it was a kind of reinvention, if you will.
Do you know what parts of you were steady through that transformation? Like what of you from your childhood or from when you were a teenager is still within you and still part of you now?
The creative, playful child is still there. And I think that is very much the source of all my creativity, and the ability to go like, okay, I'm going to do something new. I don't care what other people think. I don't care whether it's been done before or not. I think that comes from that risk-taking child part of me. Pretty much everything else, when I was a kid, I mean, I look back and I go, wow, I was terribly irresponsible as a kid. But I think it's important to preserve that sort of childlike creativity, if you will.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I have a very, let's say, anecdotal theory on this show that, like, when you come into who you are as a person, when you settle, your childhood comes back into your creative work in a way that it hadn't before. Like, because you and somehow accepting who you are, right? You're accepting yourself as a child in some way. Does that make sense at all?
Sure. And I think certainly growing up in India, there was this sense of you shouldn't be like this. You need to grow up. You need to beat that whimsical, creative, risk-taking silliness out of you. Because, you had to be a serious 9-to-5 engineer, and you couldn't possibly feel terrible about having to go in at 9 a.m. in the morning. And I think when I came back, I certainly came back with the idea that, no, it's okay to not enjoy your work. It means you need to change something. Yeah. And on the same note, it's also, I can't deal with people who treat their creative work like, oh, it's 5 o'clock, I'm done. I can't write another word from now, or I can't draw another thing now.
Yeah.
And while I completely understand that from a professional level, on a personal level, I'm just like, but it's there. It's this beautiful thing you're making. How can you possibly get up and walk away?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't understand that, just because, like, when I'm really in the flow, the rest of the world drains away. So the idea that there's like a Flintstones whistle and I punch out or something, that doesn't make much sense to me.
I mean, that was the biggest shock for me, working in what is a, consistent commercial creative industry. And I totally understand it. I totally see why. I think even things within that are changing, but there's certainly a sense of workmanship to an industry which is entirely supposed to be very creative. And I imagine this is the case in all such industries, illustration, painting, comics, film, TV, whatever it is. I just find myself more inspired, more interested in what I'm doing if I surround myself with people who are more like me. So, I collaborate with an Indian artist called Anand Radhakrishnan, who is absolutely obsessive about his pages. And if he doesn't like one thing, he will redraw it 8 times. And he will suffer through all-nighters just to get it. And you could look at all 8, and to my eye, they're like, okay, there's maybe 4 or 5% difference, but that's everything to him. Mm-hmm. Same thing, I work with a letterer called Aditya Bidikar, who is genuinely a pleasure to work with because he is absolutely on the money with everything all the time. Page sizes, font selection, colors, production values, all of those things. He's got such an eye for detail, and is someone who will volunteer his time to make sure all of those details are right. And so working with people like that, I think makes me work better. I don't know where we started. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if anything answers anything on this show, at least, but, But like another thing I'm curious about, like when you just said that, like, you know, as a child, there was this kind of, I forget how you phrase it, but like in my brain, I called it the desiccation of the whimsy, desiccation of whimsy, right?
Sure.
And I'm wondering if is that something you're getting from your parents? Is that a cultural value? In which case you're getting it from just from living in Mumbai? Like, where is that coming from? Where it's being reinforced, where you can kind of start internalizing it as like your super ego in some way?
Well, I think the answer to that is very specific and very complex. I think generally people will find it coming from parents at times, coming from the kind of cultural strata of society that you're born into. It's very hard for someone who's born into a family of, you know, mill workers to go like, okay, I'm going to become a painter now, because that concept of someone creating art that touches you and people will pay to have that happen is so far away from, you know, working 9 to 5 in a mill, or at least it used to be. Whereas if you were doing something a little bit more related to a field that everyone else could understand what you mean by that, that might be more acceptable. Now, certainly those things are true in India as well. You know, I grew up in a family of engineers and lawyers and doctors, and none of them had written anything before outside of one person that I mentioned before. And so this idea that I would write stories and people would pay to read those stories because they found them emotionally resonant, entertaining, meaningful, or a meaningful occupation of their time in some way, was such a foreign concept to someone like my dad, who's an avid reader, who you know is artistically inclined. So that was certainly part of the cultural aspect of it. But I also think on a larger scale, this is true in India. It's changing now, but it certainly was truer at the time where I was just starting to show an inclination towards writing and creative things. And I think it comes because of being a post-colonial country, where essentially India's role before 1947 was to produce things for the empire. You know, the British Empire had no use for Indian artists or Indian poets or Indian writers. And those sort of cultural aspects kind of fell away, almost were engineered out of Indian society in the 200 years that the British Empire ruled over India. You know, dances were banned, theater was banned, writing of a certain nature was banned. And so all of those things have an effect. And even to this day, again, things changing now. But if you look at people who are held up as the pinnacle of Indian writing, Indian art, tend to be from fairly well-to-do backgrounds. And if you look deep enough, you'll find some sort of Anglo connection over there. You know, look at Salman Rushdie, very much connected to Britain. His family's here. He lives here now. Vikram Seth, another big name author whose mother was a judge and educated abroad. And so you start looking at the voices that define Indian literature, Indian art, and you largely find voices that have in some measure evolved from the colonial history. And it's only in the recent 2, maybe 3 decades that that's changing. So I imagine people coming out of India now will come out with very different voices and a very different cultural background in terms of finding encouragement for their art.
I mean, when you were a kid, is that the kind of art you were connecting with? Were you trying to, I mean, I guess the term now is like decolonialization. Were you trying to like decolonize yourself in any way? Or were you still within this kind of like, you know, British mold of
no,
culture?
I mean, as a kid, I was very much reading, you know, Rudyard Kipling. Like my understanding of Indian forest life was based off of a British writer's understanding of India. And so my perceptions were I don't want to use the word tainted, but it is very much more inclined in that direction, where my perceptions of my own people and my own country were certainly tainted by a view that is entirely foreign to me, if you think about it. But that's my curriculum. That's what I grew up reading in school. I grew up watching DC and Marvel animated shows where there were no Indian superheroes. There were no Indian people doing heroic things. The only Indians who showed up wore turbans and did snake magic and were evil magicians, if you will. And so that kind of became the canvas in which my creativity existed at the time. And it was a real struggle for me because I was writing things and realizing that my first endeavor at writing anything, I imagine, I think was, or anything with some measure of seriousness, was a knockoff of Lord of the Rings. Having never been anywhere near a place that looked like the Shire, or having never experienced any kind of mythological connection to wizards in white carrying staves or anything of the sort. And obviously it was the epic nature of the storytelling and the very well-written drama that was speaking to me, but I was trying to emulate those things without having the cultural pool to draw from, if you will. And so it needed time, some measure of maturity for me to go like, okay, well, there's also all of these great things in Indian history and mythology that I can take from and do things like Tolkien or Pratchett or Gaiman or Moore did, without necessarily having to emulate what they did, rather understand what they did and then do what you're going to do on your own.
Was it just, again, I'm going to keep pointing at this rupture of like going to pen and moving. Was it that gave you that distance to do that, or were there other factors?
No, I don't think that distance came until I decided to write with some measure of seriousness. I think I was at Penn somewhere around 2003 to 2008 or 2009, something like that. And that was the first time I started reading comics with some measure of, you can actually do interesting adult literary things with comics. But it was still, largely Greco-Roman mythology or, blonde-haired farm boys being superheroes. I mean, it's a classic trope, right? So, and all of those things were great. I educated myself in the genre of these things by reading wonderfully written, beautiful stories. But none of them featured any Indian people. None of them featured any sort of cultural understanding of that I could relate to and go, okay, this is people like me. That only came after I started writing a bit more seriously after 2013. And it was actually a younger cousin who is also in the creative industries now, who pointed out to me, like, why do you always, like, in your stories, why aren't there any characters who are Indian? Why are all your characters like Tom and John and Roger? Why isn't there a Ravi? And I had no good answer. And I realized that I had never read a sci-fi story with a Ravi as a protagonist. And I think that really changed things for me. I also did work on a comic book in India called Aghori, which I was very aware I was writing for an Indian market, who had largely been sold things written for their cultural background by writers who came in from the outside, looked at it. Everyone said, Slumdog Millionaire, what a great story about India. I mean, but it's not a story an Indian would tell another Indian. Mm-hmm. It's a story Danny Boyle would tell the world about India, And this was true of comics as well. Grant Morrison had done great work with Indian mythology, but it was still Grant Morrison telling you about Indian mythology. My grandma does a better job of telling me Indian mythology than Grant Morrison, simply because it is more intimately familiar to her. And then when you get a writer who has that intimate familiarity doing something with it, the work is always that much more nuanced, that much more interesting.
Yeah. I mean, did you grow up religious at all?
I mean, I think growing up with religion around you is pretty much the default in India, at least in the time where I was growing up. My grandparents were super religious. My parents, to an extent, are still religious. I don't think my parents understand the distinction between not being religious and being vehemently religious. That just doesn't exist. The default mode is somewhere in between, and that is just a part of life. It's a way of life, if you will. And there's good and bad to that. But somewhere around my 20s, after having moved to the States, I realized and I decided that, I wasn't going to look at religion in terms of, its doctrine and its ritual and its judgments of right and wrong. I was going to look at it as stories that were meant to inspire. And I think that really opened up a whole world of inspiration for me with Indian mythology and Indian religion, if you will.
Mm. But it was never for you a matter of faith. It was a
matter of tedium for me when I was a kid.
Yeah. Same with me.
Yeah. But there's a ceremony that Brahmin families go through when you're a kid where you tie a string around your body and you're supposed to say this prayer 108 times in the morning, 108 times in the afternoon, 108 times in the evening. And my dad wasn't a particularly religious guy, but he said, you have to do this for 1 year. And then you get to decide if you want to continue doing it or not. But you have to do it because it will teach you to contend with tedium. That it's okay to have to do things, even if you don't particularly feel invested in them. And it's useful, I'll sit and write 100 emails if I have to write them for some reason. And I think a lot of it comes from there. So it's a valuable lesson, but God, it was boring.
Yeah, that was my first. I never had that feeling of faith. And the temple, I say this a lot, but temple was so boring. And my brain is maybe like this very early version of giving me some kind of space to be creative, because my brain needed something in those, I would go to temple, Friday nights, sometimes Saturday mornings. And it was just like, it was almost instantly tedium. I get it. God is great. Do we really have to do this for 45 minutes? Like, I'm sure God gets it within the first 5.
Yeah.
And I'm missing cartoons. I'm missing the X-Men.
Yeah. There's so much ridiculousness that goes around. But equally, if you do talk to people and you get interested in the philosophical side of religion and why things are structured the way they are, and you start thinking about why people need to say a prayer 108 times, that's all super interesting stuff. So I look at religion and culture from that sort of questioning everything analytical point of view. Like, what does it say about us that we've felt the need to evolve such a labyrinthine, massively ritualistic way of essentially subjugating large numbers of people to a philosophy that's supposed to be good for them? I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting questions to be asked around religion. So I am in equal measure obsessed with it and entirely not religious. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, not to loop us back around to the beginning, really, but like every once in a while, it's not that this has stopped ever, but every once in a while, I will wake up at 3 a.m. I always wake up in the middle of the night, but like, this will happen like a couple days in a row. And the first, when I'm defenseless, my brain goes, hey, you're not going to exist someday. you're not going to exist. Everyone you know is not going to exist someday. And that's just it. You can't do anything about it. And the last time this happened was a couple of weeks ago. And I started to think, I'm like, how did we gain this consciousness? It's insane to me that we gain this self-awareness. And I started to like, as a completely non-religious person, well, I shouldn't say that, as a completely not person that lacks faith, as a person without just an ounce, I was trying to think of something less than an ounce, a milliliter of faith, I was just like, well, there has to be a God somewhere, right? This seems all too insane. But I don't really, it's just this kind of like, when I have those like these like, I
mean, there's a God because we need to cope with it, right?
Yeah. So. And it's really like, that's the thing. Like when I was reading Layla Starr, that's like this thing that like got me in this like very deep way, the way that you, the kind of stuff that you were talking about in that.
Sure.
And I'm, we're right at the very end, and I'm kind of curious about your own relationship. Like, as someone who you said is not religious, do you have, are you completely scientific on this measure? Or are you just like, yeah, we're done when we're done? Is there any kind of like space for,
I mean, I don't, it would be very easy, but also a little bit facetious to say like, oh yeah, we're done when we're done. But I'm also human, and the idea of being done is entirely incomprehensible to me on some level. I just don't understand it. I can't remember where I read this, but I think it was Freud, probably, who said that we never perceive our deaths as happening to us. We always perceive our death as being witnessed from a safe distance, which is true. Like when you think of yourself dying, you never think of it as an experience happening to you. You always watch yourself. At least for me, in my head, the idea of dying is always me observing myself dying from a safe distance. And I think that's very interesting. And so I think that translates on some level to our own relationship with death as well, that on some level we maintain a safe distance from it. And so we are truly incapable of contending with it on that sort of very intimate level. But what does that mean for religion and the way I perceive it? So no, I am not entirely analytical about it. But in place of religion, I transplant romance into it, which is the way I like to look at it. That, I have, if it is true, and I am truly not going to be here, whenever death comes, then surely whatever time I do have needs to be beautiful and meaningful in some way to me. I don't care. Other people don't feature in my discussions with death, but I have to. My worst fear about death is getting there at the end, looking back and going like, I didn't enjoy that at all.
Yeah.
And so I try to. That is not to say I live hedonistically, or that is not to say that every action is meant to entertain or enjoy or bring enjoyment in some way. I think I want every action to be meaningful. Like, even if I am sad, I want it to be meaningfully sad. I want it to be for a reason, because I thought of something beautifully sad, not because, Facebook is off and I can't get in touch with people or something like that. And I think the more I try to think of life through that lens of like, everything should be romantic about life. Screw the people who tell you to deal with reality, be realistic. No, what's the point in being realistic? Being realistic is just managing expectations until you die. That's not cool. Don't manage expectations. Have great expectations. And so, yeah, I find that's how I cope with it.
That actually seems like a really nice place to end. Thanks. This has been just a delight. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I'm glad we made it.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you feel? Good or bad?
Yeah, good. I mean, this is a far more interesting discussion than I usually have about my work. So
yeah, that's why I'm always so curious. I'm like, I wasn't like, so in this panel, you wrote this. What were you? Well,
yeah. I mean, I'm happy to explain those things, but yeah, I'm always reminded of. I was at a talk with Don DeLillo at the British Library, and he had just written 0K, and the person interviewing him basically was going through their own thesis of what the book meant.
Oh, no.
And the question was largely their thesis. And then at the end of it, they tacked on, so is that what you intended?
Oh.
And he looked at them, and his response was great. He said, I am glad you got all of that out of the book. That's it. That was his answer.
That was professional. Whew. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know from being on the other side of a lot of these interviews that I'm like, well, that stuff is kind of boring. A lot of times it's boring. Like,
sure.
So how'd you break in? It's just like, I don't know.
By writing.
Yeah, literally. That's it. I mean, there's some other stuff, but it's like, yeah, someone liked my packet and I got on a late night show.
You know what that is the need to find some kind of prescriptive secret password that you need to say to the right person on the third Wednesday of the fourth month, and then you'll be allowed to be a creative person in an industry. And that is a lot easier to contend with, even though it's not true at all. It's still a lot easier to contend with than I just need to keep doing this until I get better, until I have a unique voice, until I have something interesting to say. And even then, I may not find recognition and success. And on some level, I have to be okay with going, okay, I did this for 4 years. It didn't work. I'm going to go do something else now,
And we'll see you next time. Bye. Bye, oh, 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 bye. Bye.